Hey everyone, it's Brandon here again for another video. So, in today's video, I'm going to be doing a book review, a book that I read very recently called Crazy Wisdom by Chögyam Trungpa. That is a very rough translation. I believe that is a Tibetan name, not my first, second, or fourth language. So, you know, look him up, and I would highly recommend this book to start off. So, this book is about the Vajrayana teachings of Buddhism, and what that means is basically it's supposedly the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, I think is one way of talking about Vajrayana. So, there's the Hinayana, which is sort of like the first form of Buddhism we see. Basically, that is the stuff taught by the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, or Siddhartha Gautama, depending on Pali or Sanskrit. Again, those aren't my first languages, or third or second. Anyway, so the first teachings of Buddhism were from the Buddha himself, and then there are Mahayana teachings, which are just later teachings, and I actually haven't studied a ton into those specifically, and we could get into that on a later video, what I do know about Mahayana, but that is the second major change within Buddhism, major shift within the teachings to kind of highlight different things. I know Mahayana focused a lot on the emptiness teachings. If you look at the original suttas, the Buddha talked about emptiness, but it wasn't like the main thing. Mahayana seems to make that a much bigger thing, or at least like if we talk about percentage wise of the teachings, much bigger thing. But the Vajrayana, which I believe means something sort of like the indestructible vehicle. I think that's what Vajra kind of means, at least what I've learned in this book. Although there are a lot of terms that I'm still getting used to in the more Tibetan forms of Buddhism. But I actually came across the book Crazy Wisdom because I was reading the book Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by Daniel M. Ingram. And this is one of my favorite spiritual books of all time. It's a wonderful text. It goes into crazy detail, and it's written by a medical doctor with years and years, decades of meditation experience and different Buddhist traditions, and as well as practice and other forms of spirituality too. So he's a very knowledgeable person, great for teaching the Western mind, I'd say, especially those of us who love precision and detail. Daniel Ingram is a great teacher on that front, but he recommends in that book, I was particularly in the section on where he talks about all the different models of awakening or enlightenment, and he kind of compares them, gives his own opinions and experiences with different models and how valid they are or how useful they are for practitioners. Such as one model is like the perfect action model. So like, do your individual behaviors line up with, like Jesus or the Buddha or someone seen nearly as impeccable like that? Is everything you're doing perfect? Does that line up with your understanding or your realization levels when it comes to awakening? Some people say yes, some people say no. But for example, Daniel is a little bit speculative on that one, meeting a lot of high level practitioners throughout the years. But that's just one idea. So in that section of the book, which I will say is a very long section, it goes through like, I don't know, dozens of types of measuring awakening and seeing if that's valid or not. So it's a really long chapter. And but anyway, Daniel, when he's getting into Vajrayana teachings, he recommends this book as one to read, which I will say Daniel gives a lot of book recommendations in Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and I am probably going to plan to read almost all of those throughout the years of my practicing, because just running into the first ones, not only do I just love him as a source on his own, but when I dig into the sources that he's using, I'm very, very impressed by this author. I believe from the life story that I read, I think he died when he was only 47 years old, Chögyam Trungpa. He was basically found in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as someone who at birth um, was a teacher. They realized that from like past lives, he used to be a teacher incarnated into this new human being, and basically from a very young age, his whole main deal, it's not, you're not going to public school in a Western country and learning math. You are learning awakening in the Tantric Vajrayana Buddhist system. And he had a doctorate of divinity degree. He received that when he was 18 years old. So, you guys know what a doctorate degree is, a PhD, right? So this is basically a guy that they found him, and from all the signs that they believed in the Tibetan Buddhist system, they believed that he had some basically like past life mastery of awakening. So they recognize that, they find this kid and they say, you are going to be even more of a beast at teaching people awakening, because you're going to be specifically trained your whole life to do this. Basically, like, they took a young baby or child and said, we are giving you everything we possibly can to maximize your potential as a teacher and as a practitioner when it comes to Vajrayana Buddhism, to Tibetan style Buddhism. And wow, he certainly impresses just in the way that would make you assume he'd be able to. He is a very competent teacher. You can just tell. This book really kind of knocked my socks off. Crazy Wisdom. Now, even though this is the one that Daniel recommended, I read this one first just because of my own path. I have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1 with psychotic features when I was 18. That was my first feeling and sort of realization of oneness happened just in my very first manic episode at 18. I kind of got blindsided by seeing the world in a much different way than people normally do. And I know for a fact my neurochemistry was firing on all kinds of different cylinders. And I got a taste of that from, about 18 on, and now I'm 28. So for the past decade, I've been dealing in this realm of, I have a sort of, they call it mental illness, but basically I have a condition that has genetic causes and environmental causes, and it leads me to experience internally a much different reality than most people do. And it's kind of like a reality with certain aspects on steroids, especially when it comes to like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. This kind of stuff, like, it gets peaked similar to if you took a psychedelic drug, actually very similar to it in some ways. In a manic episode, for some people, we experience very positive, blissful episodes during parts of them, and they can bring you to a feeling of like divine union, connection, awakening, all that kind of stuff. And now a lot of people question the validity of that direct experience that people with similar conditions as mine have, but I will say there's definitely a disproportionate number of people who have mental illness, but then also go really deep into spirituality and spiritual teachings and spend a long time meditating, practicing. So that's enough about that. But yeah, I had to read this book, and I was in love with it from the very start, and I read it in like a week or two. I had been going at a kind of slow, relaxed reading pace, going through Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. This is my second time reading it, and when I got to Crazy Wisdom, it was just a blast. I really had fun with this. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of what this book is about. Crazy Wisdom. First, he starts off saying that Chögyam Trungpa starts off saying spiritual materialism is something that's very bad. I brought this little prop. It's my old beads. It was a necklace. Actually, I got from a Buddhist organization that makes this sort of like spiritual seeming jewelry. And when you think of spiritual materialism, you might think about something like those beads, like it's a physical object and it sort of signifies something spiritual. That's not actually really what Chögyam is speaking about in his book. He starts off saying spiritual materialism is a very big problem, especially in the West, where there's sort of the spiritual marketplace. People like me and you probably, and all kinds of different people, go and they look up, what does this spiritual tradition teach? I'm going to go learn about this, and I'm going to learn about this other one, and Hinduism, and Christianity, and mystical Christianity, and blah, 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 and I'm going to take psychedelics, or I'm going to do whatever weird practices to get into different spiritual trips. And the author, Chögyam, is recommending that you do not do that sort of thing. He's kind of speaking against that. But the main thing when it comes to spiritual materialism, the way he defines it or he speaks about it in this book, Crazy Wisdom, is he says that spiritual materialism is essentially you believing in yourself as a firm reality and also believing in some type of an external divine that is separate from you. And he says that Buddhist teachings are not, they're actually non-theistic. They are not about God or the lack of God, really. They are more about showing you that your personality level, your ego, the thing you conceive of as a self for yourself, that is not real. It is more of an illusion. This is a very typical, normal sort of thing in Eastern spiritual traditions, is kind of pointing out the flawed nature of believing in a personal fixed identity reality for yourself. It's not that way. These teachings show. But the non-theistic element that Chögyam speaks of is basically once you unravel the self and thinking that you're a self that is separate from God, you also unravel the belief in God or the feeling of God being real. And I have to say, I've come to experience that myself, some, at least at times, when I practice meditation or when I get into deeper states or when I'm really introspecting and feeling into my direct experience. When I look deep enough, I can easily come to see that saying there's a separate Brandon Rowe real soul thing entity that's forever or has one fixed nature, and there's this like outside world or God that's separate from that completely, and they're two distinct entities, these ideas really collapse and they're gone. And I would say, like in Buddhism, maybe from my experience, what you're really wanting to get to is you delete the illusion of yourself so much that you delete the false conception of God that you have in your head too, and you're only left with the true reality, which is probably closer to what God is than what you ever thought it was or God was conceptually. That's sort of the idea. So non-theism, spiritual materialism, you're a fixed being and God's a fixed being, and or the divine are fixed things, and you're two different things, and you're separate. That's basically spiritual materialism. Chögyam doesn't like that, doesn't think you should follow that, doesn't recommend it. It goes against Vajrayana and Buddhism as a whole. Now, beyond that, what else does Chögyam recommend? So I'm going to go to read some specific examples that popped out to me when I figured I would make this video giving a review. Page 114 I have here a note. It speaks on fearlessness, fascination, inquisitiveness, and the youthful wisdom of crazy wisdom. And okay, it gives a specific example. It's about licking the honey on the edge of a razor blade. So let's get here. I'm just going to start on the second paragraph in this page 114 of our book here. When people talk about enlightenment, they usually have the idea of someone old and wise. An enlightened person, they think, is one who has been aged by experience and has thus become wise, in fact, learned. He has collected hundreds of millions of pieces of information. This makes him old and wise, trustworthy and good, enlightened. But from the point of view of crazy wisdom, enlightenment is entirely different from this. It doesn't particularly have anything to do with being old and wise. It is more like being young and wise. Because it has tremendous openness toward exploring the experiences that go on in our lives, toward exploring them psychologically, on the relationship level, on the domestic level, on the practical level, on the philosophical level, and so forth. There is a quality of fearlessness in enlightenment, not regarding the world as an enemy, not feeling that the world is going to attack us if we do not take care of ourselves. Instead, there is a tremendous delight in exploring the razor's edge. Like a child who happens to pick up a razor blade with honey on it, it starts to lick it. It encounters the sweet taste and the blood dripping off of its tongue at the same time. Simultaneous pain and pleasure are worth exploring from the point of view of the sanity of crazy wisdom. This natural inquisitiveness is the youthful prince quality of Padmasambhava. It is the epitome of non-caring, but at the same time caring so very much, being eager to learn and eager to explore. By the way, Padmasambhava is seen as sort of the main guru, from what I've learned so far, in Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism. And this book talks much about Padmasambhava. Actually, really, the way this book is structured, this book is made based on lectures that Chögyam gave in somewhere in the United States, back probably around the 70s or so. I'd have to check the exact dates on that. But just, decades ago, somewhere in the United States, Chögyam was bringing Tibetan Vajrayana tantric teachings of Buddhism to the West. Like he was kind of giving this information here for the first time, or he was one of the early teachers. And, he spent time as a monk. He had a doctorate in the study of this. He had been practicing Buddhism from birth, more or less, and had a rich tradition to support him and teach him. And he was bringing this to the West, and he was giving live talks with students, asking questions, doing questions and answers. And, this book, actually, a lot of it is question and answer. But the talks are mainly about the 8 aspects of Padmasambhava, of this original teacher of Vajrayana in Tibet. And basically, Padmasambhava is supposedly someone who was born as an 8-year-old child out of a lotus in the middle of a lake. So he didn't have, the story goes, he did not have physical, human parents, and he was born at, the normal infant stage, like they've been in the womb for maybe about 9 months or something. No, Padmasambhava supposedly was born out of a lotus, somewhere in Afghanistan. And it's a very mythical thing. And Chögyam, he recognizes that it's he's not trying to teach you that this is some purely literal thing. He's really trying to transmit the spirit of the living Padmasambhava within you, that will come into these teachings and find the same aspects of reality that were taught before, that were brought to Tibet from Padmasambhava. The idea is that this being, this guru, this larger than life sort of entity that was talked about as Padmasambhava, he was seen as Dharmakaya, or you could say, in a sense, the unconditioned element of awakening in the Buddha's teachings. He was that element really to its fullest, or in a full form, at the moment when he was born. When he first came to the world, he already had that aspect of awakening basically maxed out or taken very far. And so he's born as a young child, with an 8-year-old body. And he's not born, crying and screaming and looking for milk. He's born as just an intelligent, youthful child full of this awakening juice, more or less. And he's bringing it to the people of Tibet later on in his life. And it's a wonderful story, and it goes through, but basically, Chögyam is going through the 8 main aspects of this guru. And in doing that, he's teaching you about Vajrayana and how to practice it, more or less. So we have the first idea that spiritual materialism is an issue, right? But now we're getting later into more the middle half of the book, and this teaching about the child who licks honey on the edge of the razor. From my experience, like, when you're in a truly altered state of consciousness, so to speak, or when you're in like a very blissful, sort of realized state of consciousness where you're not concerned about normal practical worries, as most people are, when you begin to see the nature of reality, you do begin to become fearless. You begin to stop putting up barriers against the world. And that's one of the things he talks about, of course, in that paragraph. And it's this opening yourself to reality, whether it's pleasure or pain. You have a pure fascination and interest in the world. And that actually relates to one of the other kayas, they say, to the Sambhoga kaya, which is, there's Dharmakaya, Sambhoga kaya, and Nirmanakaya. And Dharmakaya, in the way that he teaches it, is basically, in a simple way of saying it, it's like the unconditioned aspect of the Dharma, the unconditioned sort of aspect of awakening, which I can kind of see in a rough way translating to the experienceless nibbana or nirvana. The state of cessation, I think, is probably a great way of explaining that, kind of in a more concrete way, is seeing like literally the part of reality that isn't manifest yet, that also creates the manifest experiential world. Some people might be on board with what I'm saying there, some might not be, but either way. So it goes into the Sambhoga Kaya, is, as Chögyam describes, is moving beyond the Dharmakaya, which is basically the unconditioned and the unmanifest, the sort of part of reality that hasn't shown any direct form yet, but is pregnant and ready to express itself and ready to manifest itself. Sambhoga Kaya is the manifesting of something into the world. And as a part of this aspect of awakening, it's very focused around the sort of fascination and this sort of just enjoyment and exploration of reality as things are fresh and new and being born and created into the world. And then the Nirmanakaya is the final element of the three, and Nirmanakaya is basically going more into the practical parts of life. How do you go from being connected to the unconditioned, unmanifest, sort of perfect world that, as part of the Dharmakaya, accepts all of reality? It's like, you could almost say, in a sense, like part of it line up with the teachings about awakening that are like, just awareness itself. People talk about awareness. I'm the awareness. It's accepting of everything. It's not the phenomena themselves, but it's the space that the phenomena take part in, or come into, that space that holds, that awareness that holds all of reality in it and allows it to be created, and doesn't have sort of like this harsh rejection, or clinging after things that maybe an individual being, like an ego like Brandon Rowe would have. Like Brandon Rowe loves a certain type of donuts in his town, and the lighting got messed up there. Anyway, so I have certain wants and likes and dislikes, and certain things I'll react negative to, like certain types of pain or painful sensations. Dharmakaya is seen as like the more overall accepting aspect of reality too. Sambhogakaya is more like something's coming into reality and you're fascinated with it, and that's part of the practice on practicing on the Sambhogakaya level. Then Nirmanakaya, of course, comes into the reality. Like something that's practical is like if you want to go further along the teachings of the Buddhist path, it's not just being accepting or practicing open awareness, in like a general sense, or just really looking into reality and being fascinated by whatever's happening and paying deep attention to it. That's not all. There's also the practical part of like you need to sit down and do sitting meditation practice. I mean, that's part of it. You need to actually do the work in that sense. And you still need to interact with the world in a normal way. People are still trying to make money. There are still resources that people more or less need. There's shelter, food, clothing, all these type of normal relative things. As we move from the Dharmakaya, the unmanifest, the part of reality that's pregnant with potentiality, we move into that potentiality being created, and we interact with it, and then in the process of it being created, it then becomes something practical that we relate to and think we need things to be a certain way to survive. And that's the practical Nirmanakaya level. As far as I understand it from this book, that's a rough description. So if we look at the honey on the edge of the razor blade, this is someone who's willing to take risks for awakening. This is someone who's not as worried about the Nirmanakaya sort of normal ways of seeing the world. Like, oh, if I cut my tongue, I'm screwed, man. It'll have to heal for like 4 days. So, like, we're really worried about that kind of stuff. Have you ever noticed, like, just very lightly licking a razor blade? Think about how much, when you're in a normal survival based, I need to make money, I need to, pay rent kind of, when you're in that frame of mind, purely practical level, when you go and you're thinking about licking a razor blade, even if it's very lightly, it'll just be a tiny, clean cut on your tongue. There's so much repulsion, so much aversion to that. But then a child who's never experienced that sort of pain, or the sort of the results of doing something like that, they can lick the honey, and they'll get the sweet taste that they want, and they get a little cut, and they say, oh well, I liked the treat. And then for a few days maybe they whine about their tongue being hurt, but at the end of the day, we end up maybe being more resilient than what our egos would want to make us believe. So that's part of the fearlessness aspect. So now let's go into the second part here, which is page 119. And I'm going to relate this simile that we talked about, the honey on the edge of a razor blade, to the Four Noble Truths more traditionally versus the Crazy Wisdom Way. So we heard it described in the Crazy Wisdom Way. Now let's go and hear about it more in the traditional, original Buddhist teaching form that doesn't have this crazy wisdom twist on it. So So a student asks Chögyam during this lecture, where he talks about the razor blade and honey simile. The student says, I encountered the metaphor you used of licking the honey from a razor blade. I encountered the metaphor you used of licking honey and from a razor blade in the life and teaching of Naropa. There it appeared as a simile connected with the Four Noble Truths. That is, portraying suffering that ought to be avoided or that an enlightened person would avoid, knowing it was there. Does your use of it here mean that from Padmasambhava's viewpoint, the Four Noble Truths are no longer true? And Chögyam, or as we see here in the book, it says Trungpa Rinpoche. It's a different way of approaching the truths, or not exactly different, but authentic. We might say, here suffering is not regarded as something that you should avoid or abandon. Rather, it should be regarded as truth. See what I mean? And the student says, it's what you taste. Trungpa, it's what you taste, yes, while exploring the subtleties of everything as an infant would. Student, does that exploration have to be painful? Trungpa, pain is arbitrary at this point. Experiences are not particularly regarded as painful or pleasurable. They just are. Student, you said that the child was fearless, and then you said that cowardice is the path. Aren't those two contradictory? Trungpa, they both amount to the same thing at this point. You are fearless because you do not go beyond certain limitations. You are fearless as it is, and therefore you are a coward at the same time. That may be very difficult to grasp. I don't know whether I'm making myself clear. So I'll pause there real quick. I do need to take a break in the recording of this. But I will say one of the aspects that's talked about in this crazy wisdom practice and living it is you will have a certain level of caution. You'll know that if you go too far in life, there will be big consequences to pay. And what the teacher, Chögyam Trungpa, is teaching us here is that you can be fearless because there are certain things that are without your bound or outside of your boundaries, outside of what you have the capability to do right now. And for the most part, as long as you don't break the rules, so to speak, and go beyond what you're really prepared for, you'll be fine. So as long as you don't go and do major things that would risk your health or potentially harm another person, you can live your life in a fearless way that also retains the caution that you need to be fine on the Nirmanakaya or practical level of things. So I'm going to take a break in recording this, but I'm really enjoying teaching what I've learned from this book, and I hope you guys are as well. Okay, so I had an appointment there. I had to take a brief break. So back to business. What is one of the most important things I should probably try to relay? If we're talking about this book, and if we're talking about the teachings of Chögyam Trungpa, it is hopelessness. Hopelessness is a key part of his teaching, and he says there's no start to the path of crazy wisdom. There's no beginning that path. without a type of absolute hopelessness, which is interesting because it's so different than what we might hear in the approach of other spiritual systems, other teachings on awakening, or if it's Christianity or a deity focused religion such as that. Um, we hardly ever hear go for max hopelessness. Like that's how you're going to find success, or how you'll even start the beginning of the path, is through hopelessness. Now, I mean, there you can find elements of this in other spiritual teachings, but I will say how I relate to this and what I take away from the book when it comes to hopelessness on the spiritual path is, if you look at the teachings of Vajrayana, a lot of it is leading you back to exactly where you are. And one thing that Chögyam says when he's speaking of Padmasambhava's adventures and things that he, in a sense, learned, or at least what him as a guru, what he represents, a lot of it is you realize that you never needed to take the journey of awakening. And I've had, bits and pieces of seeing this for myself, as well as the hopelessness aspect. If you actually look to some of my videos, like the one titled The Nirvanic Treadmill that I made maybe a couple months ago, the main thing that I'm talking about with that is that if you hope for your situation to be better by manipulating life in a certain way to where you'll be permanently happy, is what we're really kind of, we look for that in a sense. We're hoping that there's some solution that we really get to the heart of things and stop suffering and feel awesome all the time. This is ultimately the wrong approach. I would say, from my experience, from my practice, this is what I've been led to. And I've, been informed by the teachings of especially Buddhism. And what Chögyam Trungpa is saying in Crazy Wisdom makes perfect sense to me now. Because when you reach a state of hopelessness, what this is really saying is that you're not expecting to go anywhere or to do anything fantastic for any ultra realization to occur that's outside of what's already always true. You're looking in what you already are, in the experience that's already occurring. Now, of course, when I say what you already are, we're not talking about, the ego as some fixed real thing. It's a matter of speaking. We're just using those words to communicate. I hope you guys understand. I'm not trying to say that ego is how we're getting these results or how we're making quote unquote progress on this path. A lot of progress on this path is doing all these practices, meditating, learning from all these different traditions, to only find that the real solution is to live human life and to be, to you could say, have the Dharmakaya aspect of being willing to hold whatever life is going to send to you, being accepting of it, not rejecting it. It's like, if you want to look at this almost from like a Christian lens, you can be thankful or grateful for what God brings to you in each moment and accept it more as a blessing and as something you can use to grow, that God is sending to you for your benefit, not as some punishment. If you look at reality and life as a type of punishment, well, of course, your experience of life is going to be almost purely negative, if that's your frame of mind. So that's one thing. Now, if we look at the Sambhogakaya element, I mean, a part of that, too, is we can be fascinated and we can be interested in what life brings to us. So not only do we just kind of have a general acceptance and allowance of life to come, we are thoroughly engaged and enjoying life and looking into it, looking deeper. What more is here in this experience that I have? What can I see that's deeper? What can I be fascinated by? And then we have the Nirmakaya level, which is how can I practically live life and have the acceptance, have the fascination, and then still do normal life things and maintain the practice? How can I bring the spiritual practice and realizations into my normal life? And in a sense, I will say crazy wisdom, part of it, and just from what it seems from Chögyam Trungpa's teachings in this book, it appears that a lot of the Vajrayana teaching is similar in some ways to the idea of karma yoga, you might say, in some forms of Hinduism. But it's in a sense it's more than that, and it's actually a point that the author makes in this book, is that Hinduism has its limitations and it's not in full agreement with at all what he's trying to teach. But he says that some of the more realized teachings, like the Advaita teachings, if you look at the actual very source material, they were pretty close in a sense. They were actually getting to the not two-ness of things. But there, of course, always comes a problem if you speak of there not being two. There's this specter of you're trying to get rid of two to find non-two. And that leads you ultimately to more or less some experience of two, you could say. But anyway, so, I like to see karma yoga as basically live life effectively and live a vigorous, vital life, engaged with everything, and do your best. And don't be afraid of losing the ego. Just simply perform your duty. That's a partially, that's a partially Hindu perspective of how you could also approach Vajrayana. In a sense, it is like that, because you're fusing awakening with living a normal life. And this essentially lines up with all kinds of other Buddhist teachings in other traditions. And one thing that I've learned from Chögyam Trungpa is that it's not only Vajrayana that we're looking at. And I learned this also, too, from beginning to read his book, Journey Without Goal, that I showed you earlier. That was recommended by Daniel Ingram. With that book, he also brings up the fact that you're just... How can I put this? You're using the early teachings of Buddhism, the later forms of Buddhist practice that had, if they quote unquote added anything, or like the focus on emptiness, maybe that came a bit more from Mahayana and all those other aspects, you're building upon those to create something that's like Vajrayana practice. But Vajrayana, in a sense, is nothing but living the Buddhist path and living out those insights. The whole goal is to get to what the Buddha taught. And even though it seems like we're going to later and later sources, even in a different country, a lot of this is coming from, even much of it being, initially started in a different language, we're living the same Buddhist path, but just with some new different tools and angles that we can illuminate the whole thing for. But another thing is, what this teacher has brought to me to understand is it's not about the goal. Vajrayana is not about the goal of reaching somewhere. He says the path is the goal. Where you're at now is already the goal. You're not trying to go on some crazy path to get to somewhere else. Where you're at, living the path is the goal. And living the path, in the sense you could say, living the fourth noble truth, being on the path, the eightfold noble path, that is already the result. That's already the goal. That's more the goal than the attainment of some state. Because without the path, you ultimately have no goal that's ever reached, no attainment that ever comes. And in a sense, all of the attainments of Buddhism, and I don't, this might be stretching it too far, but to me, it really seems accurate to say if you take the system further and further, you realize more and more that where you're at already is something you can work with. But yes, when it comes to this hopelessness aspect, we're really saying we don't expect our individual kind of manipulations of reality to do us any good when it comes to realization. We accept that we're not going anywhere in a sense, and the hopelessness itself, it's very deep, the way that he discusses it, the way that Chögyam Trungpa speaks about it in Crazy Wisdom. It goes a lot deeper than I think levels that I had ever really contemplated. It's working on very much the same thing and similar foundation, but he describes even when you reach that hopelessness is still not an answer to you. A lot of people, they get to the hopelessness and they seem like they've found something that works that they can rely on. Yes, I can be hopeless and I don't have to expect anything more of reality. That's where I can be comfortable. No, he says it's further than that. You need a hopelessness that's so pure that the hopelessness is not trying to take you to something good. You've literally lost all hope of getting anywhere. And it goes even further than that. And I will say, reading this book has been a form of practice for me. I mean, this is how I like to read these spiritual texts. As I'm coming across the information, I'm also trying to experience the truths that they talk about, experience the teachings in real time as I come in contact with we see concepts, we see words, but I'm really trying to allow it to take my practice just one step further with each thing that I come in contact to. Everything that's brought to me from a great teacher like the author of this book, I use that as an actual practice in the moment. And so with this hopelessness aspect, it got me into some very interesting states of consciousness, you could say. And it took my contemplation that was already pretty much like contemplation that can happen without words. You can't really quite explain it that well, but it's happening and you feel it and it's in the moment and it's real, so to speak, real. This looking in a sense for this absolute hopelessness, but knowing that looking for it is hopeless and not the way to get it, and living that was a great practice. And I would say it can take you pretty far if you do it the way that he describes. If you read this book and you actually say, okay, I'm going to get really hopeless, so hopeless that I realize I can't make this hopelessness up. I'm just going to live life, and eventually, if I reach the level of hopelessness that can start the path to crazy wisdom, then I'll get there. Now, let me read. I've got another page that I noted later on in the book. This is the last reading example I'll give here. I'm going to read the majority of page 142 and then relate this to some of my path. Some of my, you could call it crazy wisdom path, or my own individual way of seeing that. So, page 142, we might find it difficult to follow what this experience is about, or to identify ourselves with it. We might find hearing about this like listening to a story in which such and such a thing happened, and then after that everybody lived happily ever after. But the story of Padmasambhava should be something more than that. If we actually relate with what happens in the life of Padmasambhava, we will find that it is quite realistic and personal. We acknowledge sanity, and then sanity comes about by itself. Acknowledging sanity is a discipline or a pretense. You pretend to be the Buddha. You believe you are the Buddha. Again, we are not talking about Buddha nature as an embryonic state, but of the living situation of Buddhahood having already happened. We adopt such a pretense at the beginning, or maybe we should call it a belief. It is a belief in the sense that our Buddhahood is seemingly not real, but we take it as a reality. Some element of mind's trickery is necessary. And then we find ourselves having been tricked into enlightenment. There are all kinds of tricks that exist as a part of the teaching process. They are known as skillful means. That seems to be something of a euphemism. Skillful means are part of the spiritual tradition. The lineage gurus conduct in relating with students is a traditional discipline. Skillful means are necessary because there is a tendency to run away from sanity of this nature. Students might find sanity too spacious, too irritating. We would prefer a little claustrophobic insanity. Snug and comforting insanity. Getting into that is like crawling back into a marsupial's pouch. That's the usual tendency, because acknowledging precision and sanity is too crispy, too cool, too cold. It's too early to wake up. We'd rather go back to bed. Going back to bed is relating to the mind's deceptions, which in fact we prefer. We like to get a little bit confused and set up our homes in that. We don't prefer sanity or enlightenment, in fact. That seems to be the problem, rather than that we don't have it or can't get it. If we really prefer basic sanity or enlightenment, it's irritatingly possible to get into it. That actually went on a little bit to the next page, 143. So, with that, I actually ran into this, in a sense, a very similar thing happened to me in my practice. And I'll actually tie this into some of what Daniel Ingram writes about in his book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. So, Daniel talks about it's very easy when you have a great experience or maybe even reach what in the early Buddhist tradition, according to Daniel, is a permanent level of awakening, like the first level of awakening, similarly often called stream entry or sotapanna. You're a stream winner. You've entered the stream that carries you on to enlightenment. You will no longer, after enough time, you will no longer be in this same world of samsara, of birth and death. You will reach full enlightenment after attaining stream entry. The stream takes you to full enlightenment. So let's say you attain that first large attainment of you get to become a stream enterer, a stream winner, and you get what Daniel will claim, or at least in his book claims, the first level of awakening comes after your first taste of what you could in a sense call ultimate reality or emptiness, or maybe in a sense we almost might say a bit of a taste of what Dharmakaya could be like in a sense. You know, we're talking about reaching this almost non-existent thing, this state of cessation, and there are many other attainments and other great experiences that can happen in meditative practice that can make us feel like we've gotten somewhere or achieved something great. Daniel really urges people not to get too carried away, to wait before they claim that they've had a certain level of attainment. But he also says, you know, it happened to him and others. And really, it sounds like almost many people who get far in these meditative traditions, who seem to get a deep level of realization, although it's recommended against, it's often that they overcall their attainments, or they say, I am hotter stuff than they actually are. You know, they get convinced that they've really done something even better than maybe what they actually have, which they could have a great attainment in a sense, really get some key insight into reality, really see things clearly for a moment. But It's easy to overcall, but what Chögyam Trungpa is saying, this is actually a key component of the crazy wisdom process. To actually reach the crazy wisdom, part of it is realizing that you are tricking yourself into full attainment. You're saying, I am already there, even if you don't feel like it. But in a sense, I'll say, in my experience, when you reach a certain state of consciousness or something really clicks on your spiritual path and it seems like the greatest thing ever, you reach a state where you feel like you've, or maybe let's say you go through cessation even, or what you think is cessation, and coming out of it you feel completely changed, and you go on and your experience transforms, and you just have insight after insight, and you're going through the stages of insight, maybe as they're described in Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. But you go through this process where you really feel to have gotten somewhere. For me, I did claim attainments. I claimed attainments that I don't think in a real context ever existed before. And it was very particular to my path, right? And it even played to some of my authenticity, but what I claimed. But at the end of the day, I claimed being the highest level of Buddha that there is, supposedly, at least that I had come into contact with, from what I had learned so far at that point in Buddhism, which this was a few years ago. This was in summer. It was May 28th, I think, 2021. And one sign that you've gotten a pretty good insight is if years later you actually remember the exact day. That might be a hint that maybe you hit something real, and maybe some level of real attainment. Maybe. But whether it was some real level of high attainment or not, or maybe it was just a trick of my own mind and my ego was inflated and I believed something that wasn't true. The thing is, I believed it. And I actually believed it so much that I did play it up to more than what it was in a technical sense. According to these Buddhist maps, especially if you line them up the way Daniel Ingram talks about them, I overclaimed some things, and I even came to some wrong conclusions, based on the technical stuff that I read about attainments, because I was riding this high from this shift that happened to me. But the thing is, I claimed that I was a Sammasambuddha, which is basically a Buddha who has awakened when there was no path to awakening that he had learned from. There was no Dharma that he had come in contact with as a teaching from another Buddha. You actually discovered the Dhamma yourself. And there are ways that this may not make sense because, I knew full well about Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, they might say, Gautama Buddha. I knew about his story. I had heard about other Buddhas, but I attained this moment of cessation or stream entry. It appeared at the time, maybe actually was, because of some very interesting circumstances in my own life, and it actually had to do with what you could more or less call some mystical Christianity, and Christianity in the sense of approaching it from the Luciferian direction. Now, I'm not talking about like sacrificing, animals or something, or, doing some Masonic ritual or nothing like that. The way I looked at Luciferianism was, the primary part is looking at the actual stories that we see and hear in Christianity, and looking like, what does it say about Lucifer? He's seen as, someone who had too much pride, so much pride that they tried to rival God or the absolute. And, they had a fall for this. Something bad happened as a result of this. But if you look at it from another lens, in a sense of a spiritual practice for yourself, or a stage that you could get to or realize or experience for yourself, maybe even a mistake you make for yourself, but it's just part of the path of awakening, or part of a path of awakening that could happen, is I look at it as sort of this ultimate individuation process, this process of picking your own potential and your own, really just seeing what you are and trusting your individual worth and your individual skill and your intellect and your experience, and just trusting that the one, you could say, even a sense, pretty much your ego, you trust that is greater than anything else. And if you can do that only but for a moment, and in the sense do that and trust that it lines up with permanent awakening or enlightenment. I mean, you can literally, for me, I tricked myself into stream entry, it seemed like, through a Luciferian path, which more or less was a way of relating with Luciferianism that really hardly any people who call themselves Luciferians would have ever done. So basically, I tricked myself into a Buddhist attainment of awakening using a path that no one had ever done it before. And for me, to myself, I was like, the Samasambuddha of Luciferianism. I did it. That's Brandon Rowe. No one else. No one else has done it that way that I've ever heard of, or, and I assume it probably, in the way that it happened, I mean, there are a lot more details to how it happened. There's actually a video I have that's still up, how to experience back-to-back sensations through love and bhakti or something like that, from around 2021, summer or fall area. You can find that video, and I go into much more detail. Talk about, psychics and tarot readers and a bunch of shenanigans, and the details come in, and you can come in contact with that and see that, when it all happened, much of my manic, lunatic, crazy self was coming out in a unique way. Authentic way, whether it was good or bad or weird or repulsive, that's to be decided by other people. But that was just one moment, but there are plenty of other moments, and there are plenty of other teachers who point to the idea of really having conviction. I mean, if you look to the greats of any spiritual tradition, they're the people usually who claimed the highest thing. Now, there's some people in spiritual circles and traditions, and they really value humility, but at the same time, the humility of the person at the very top of the hierarchy, we might say, if there is humility, it's not necessarily a false humility, but there's also the very great, real, true realization of their own capabilities. And I believe if we can see ourselves, even, like I said, for only an instant, to be of full potential, like you're literally God, all of reality. You could say you're emptiness. You could say you're not two. You could say you're so not two that there's not even not two, and you're that one. Or you could say you're so one that there's not even one and there's zero. Maybe some of you can follow with some of that stuff, some of that lingo. But if you just look at yourself, okay, I'm the most awakened thing there's ever been, nothing can come close to me. If you can actually believe that for a moment, you can probably get to a pretty high state of consciousness in a sense. And it might even be so much that it can actually produce some type of shift or insight. And maybe even if you trick yourself and you don't get some real attainment, you will actually learn from that experience. You'll learn from overestimating yourself. And I'd say, in a sense, a lot of the time, you'll learn from and get further in your path from overestimating yourself than you will from underestimating yourself. If you overestimate yourself, you'll reach high. You'll aim high. You'll try to go maybe beyond your potential or beyond your current capabilities. But in doing so, you really give a certain type of effort or commitment, um, or just energy. You give a certain level of energy. But if you're always underestimating yourself, you're always cutting down your potential, like at the beginning. You're not even giving yourself a chance to see where your potential might lie. So I would just say here, whether it comes to a practice you can do right now for yourself, and you can really relate with this, um, maybe you can't, maybe you can, but I'm just gonna say, even before I came into contact with a lot of the things that Crazy Wisdom talks about, I had contacted a lot of similar lines of insight or understanding or thinking or practice, through other sources, and through other means. And I'll just say that Chögyam Trungpa really thoroughly impressed me. I think he probably was a realized master. I'm very quite certain of that from the level of teaching that I've come in contact with already. And I'm really going to be reading more of his books. I already have, Journey Without Goal. That's my next book that I'm gonna read. I'm gonna finish that one, and I might just go buy more of his books. I might go on a sort of reading spree of his books alone. We'll see. We'll see how the next book goes, but only like less than 20 pages in, I've already literally been brought to tears, by the power of what he's teaching, and how he does it, and it really connected with me. So there might be more on book reviews for this specific teacher. So if that sounds like something good to you, I'm going to bring the normal YouTube commercialized bullshit and say, subscribe if you want to see more, like if you enjoyed this content, join my Patreon, buy my hoodies that are for sale. I don't have any hoodies for sale, but just buy them anyway. Do all the normal YouTube stuff that people say at the end of videos, just everything. This is the normal part where I say all the dumb stuff that everybody does to try to spread their personal brands. This is my weirdest, awkwardest, dumbest, most long-winded way of doing that. And if you're getting annoyed by how unskillfully I'm doing this compared to almost anyone else on YouTube, then you should probably just go ahead and like it, or I'm going to keep doing it like this at the end of videos. I'm going to keep doing it. Maybe one day you'll get tricked into watching another Brandon Rowe clip where he just talks about like and subscribe to my content, but he does it way too long. And it's going to sneak into your algorithm one day. Like special operative, freaking Navy SEAL, just fucking come at you when you're least expecting it, or like a CIA psyop. My fucking ending outro of videos is going to come at you, and it's going to say freaking like and subscribe. And at that point in time, I'll probably still not have that much of a following, and that's okay, I guess, more or less. I'm going to accept that. I'm going to Dharmakaya that shit, and I'm going to Sambhogakaya it, even Sambhogakaya it, even, and I'm going to say I'm fascinated with how unsuccessful I am at YouTube, and I'm just going to say I'm going to Nirmanakaya it too, and I'm going to say, you know what, guys, it just is what it is. I ain't the most famous guy on YouTube, and maybe that's even a good thing. It probably is a good thing. Probably is a good thing that I'm not the most famous person. That would probably be just weird. Just be weird. We'd be in a different world. So, with that, I'm going to let you guys go. Long video, huh? But, hopefully you got something good from it. Again, like, subscribe. I'm just going to we'll keep going. We'll make this longer winded than it could have been if I had just stopped it a couple minutes ago, but it's just gonna keep going. Maybe the watch time, some weird person right here has gotten to the watch time. I'm gonna say to this person who's gotten to this point in the rant, I love you. I'll see you next time, and I'm sorry for ranting so awkwardly at the end.